Assuring that the scales of justice work equally for all in the criminal justice system is not simply a pipeline from underfunded schools to overcrowded jails. It requires vigilance.
The vigilance the president is talking about is desperately needed because there is a crisis in our justice system, a crisis that we all must address. In 1971, President Nixon launched a war against drugs. At the time, there were 300,000 Americans in prison. 300,000. That number then exploded to more than 2 million. That's a 700% increase. And that increase comes primarily from the minority population. It's been 150 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet today, there are more African Americans living under correctional control, in prison, in jail, on probation or parole, than were slaves in 1850. Just think about that for a moment. In some states, blacks comprise 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. 1 in every 106 white men go to prison. But for black men, that number is 1 in every 15. This disparity flies in the face of all the facts about drug use. A study by the National Institute of Drug Abuse found that white students use cocaine at 7 times the rate of black students. They use crack at 8 times the rate of black students, and heroin at 7 times the rate of black students. Joining me now, civil rights lawyer and advocate Michelle Alexander. She's author of the book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And filmmaker Eugene Jaracki, his documentary, The House I Live In, explores the country's war on drugs. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Michelle, let me start with you. You were a civil rights attorney, and when you found out this data, I read it changed you, and that's what led to you crystallizing it in the book, The New Jim Crow.
After years of representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement and trying to help people who are released from prison, face one barrier, one legal roadblock after another to getting a job, getting access to housing, getting even food stamps, I had an awakening that our criminal justice system now functions much more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention or control.
Eugene, in your film, you really had a part where you talked about once people finish serving time, they still face huge barriers. Listen to this clip and explain it to us.
Sure. When he gets out of the prison, he can't get a job in most places because of his record.
If you have a felony charge, you need to be working. You need to be trying to move yourself forward.
If he wants to go back to school, to go to college, he's ineligible by law for certain grants.
Medical issues, if you have any.
He can't get certain health care benefits. He can't live in certain neighborhoods. His family that was the centerpiece of his life, if they're living in public housing, they can't take him in.
Well, one of the things we learned when we went to prisons all over this country was that corrections people who are wardens, jailers, prison guards, they all told us very often the same thing, and it was a complaint about the system. I thought they were all going to be tough on crime, lock them up and throw away the key. But what so many people who run the prisons said is they said, look, we try to do the best we can by these people, but the laws are so tough out there, and Congress people are profiting politically by sounding tough on crime so much that all they do is flood us with human beings by having tougher laws that make more and more time for people. We lived for a very long time with the idea crack is a black drug and powder is a white drug. Well, the actual facts that I discovered when I made the film is crack was never a black drug. Right. The majority of crack users in the United States of America are and always have been white. Once you know that fact, it reminds you how much propaganda has hoodwinked us for 40 years about these drugs. And so my message is we need a proper, educated, scientific, smart, public health approach to addiction to replace the now failed drug war.
One of the reasons that our drug policy has been so insane in practice is because the motivation for the drug war was never at bottom about ending drug abuse and drug addiction. If that had been the motivation, then we would have poured billions of dollars into drug treatment. But we didn't do that. Instead, we slashed funding for drug treatment and poured billions of dollars into building prisons and jails and filling them with black and brown youth. And this is because of the racial politics that animated the war on drugs. We were experiencing the economic collapse of inner city communities at precisely the same time there was a backlash brewing against the civil rights movement. So, in the 70s and early 80s, former segregationists were saying law and order and get tough instead of segregation forever.
You say, Eugene, in the film that this nation has a history of we've criminalized drugs to target certain ethnic groups.
Yes.
Listen, look at this.
Now, of course, you can't throw people in jail simply because they're Chinese, but you can throw them in jail because they smoke opium. In the same way, we saw things going on with cocaine. Again, it was middle-aged, successful people in this country, business executives, physicians, housewives, all perfectly legal. But then around the turn of the century, cocaine began being associated with blacks. They could withstand police bullets, it was thought. They can work hard all day, all night long, and all day long again, threatening the jobs of white workers. And so laws began to be passed against cocaine.
Cocaine evil among Negroes, I saw in that last article.
Yeah, that wasn't a recent headline, but it might as well be, because we've never really left some of those old stereotypes. I mean, I do want to say one thing, because I think it's very important to make the progress we need to make socially on this issue. The president and the attorney general have actually done something in Washington where nothing gets done. They have made a very serious move against the drug war for the first time in its history.
But the problem, Michelle, with the new Jim Crow is that unless we have this message out and translate that into legislators, it will expire with the term of the president. And I think that's what's frightening.
Much more can be done, and it's going to take an awakening within our communities, and a real movement must be built. If
and we must make sure there's not a regression after this administration. Michelle Alexander and Eugene Jarecki, such an important issue. Thank you so much for both of your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.